One of the translations that I am looking at all the time is the Christian Standard Bible, the CSB. And in my series of videos called The Best Bible Translation, I have one called The CSB is the Best Bible Translation. As a reminder for those of you who didn't hear this before, or I guess it's not a reminder if you didn't hear it, but a reminder for those who did, and informing you for those who didn't, I have a whole series on the best Bible translation because I believe that any given major translation is the best Bible translation for certain people in certain circumstances. And I want to talk about the people and circumstances for which the CSB might be the best Bible translation. To be utterly clear, this is once again no effort to undercut the value of the LSB. People sometimes hear me talk about a given translation, and because they're assuming that I'm answering the question, which Bible translation is best, they think I'm cutting down others. Instead, I say the more the merrier. Toss all the good ones in, and the CSB is a good one. I want to give a couple reasons why the CSB is the best Bible translation for you. The CSB is best for you if your church already uses the CSB, and yours doesn't, so this doesn't really apply. But I want you to think through this still. No matter what English translation your pastor chooses, if it's an evangelical church, be grateful. He did good. The CSB website, for example, and one of my friends preaches from the CSB, says that more than 100 scholars from 17 denominations participated in the translation and review of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which was first published as a complete text in 2004 and then later was revised into the Christian Standard Bible. And I looked at the dozens of names on this list, and I recognized nearly 40 of those names, meaning either that I'd read something by them or read reviews of something by them or seen them in evangelical biblical studies circles. So these are big names in my world, evangelical academic biblical studies. They hail from many institutions that teach evangelical students. They write commentaries and journal articles and dictionary entries and monographs. A lot of the nameless and faceless Bible study material that you encounter in the notes in your study Bible that maybe you never stop to think, who wrote this note? It was a human. It wasn't an angel. It wasn't the Apostle Paul. Those humans had to go to school for a lot of years. Their wives, it's usually men, it's not always, there are some female biblical scholars, but usually these men, their wives had to marry them at a time when they had very little prospect of financial success, because not only were they going into some kind of debt to study theology, but they were studying theology, which is not exactly known as a growth industry when it comes to finances. These are people who've given their lives to study the Bible at a deep level and to teach it effectively. And there are people to whom we ought to be grateful, even if they're not perfect. They do conferences, they teach classes. They're the ones who build the intellectual superstructure that ends up withstanding some of the waves, the winds and waves that attack the Christian church. Are they sinners, and are some of them turncoats? Well, yes, they're sinners. Are some of them turncoats? Not in the evangelical world, I wouldn't say. Even the evangelical scholars that I tend to disagree with on more significant issues, if they've held on to the label evangelical, that generally means for me much more good than bad. There are disagreements in evangelicalism, but those rarely impact the translations because there are multi-denominational committees who make them. When you collect this many trained and gifted evangelical scholars to make an English Bible translation, they're probably not going to commit very many obvious errors. That's for a number of reasons. One is that they're trained. Another is that there's a bunch of them, and that there are checks and balances on the committee, and there are checks set up, multiple checks, editorial checks of various kinds. This takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to do a translation well. It's also the case that nobody is really starting fresh. Everybody nowadays in our lifetimes has had the Tyndale King James tradition to rely upon, and it is still the baseline. Tyndale casts an excellent shadow over all of our evangelical English Bible translations and even the non-evangelical ones. So, maybe your translation that you have in front of you, and certainly the CSB, might miss some obscure bit of Hebrew. But even the King James translators themselves said in their preface, they were simply unsure of the meaning of some obscure Hebrew terms. They specify like the names of plants and animals and gems. Surely if we had a God's eye view, we would see a few things in the CSB that truly ought to be changed, even corrected. But the likelihood that those things are found in doctrinally significant places is incredibly low. The likelihood that they warrant you putting pressure on your pastor to switch to a different translation, if, let's imagine, your pastor uses the CSB, that likelihood is even lower, like lower than the temperature of your grandmother's extremities during winter, like lower than molasses in January that's been placed on the bottom shelf in the basement, lower than Larry Flint. Number 2 point about the CSB is best for people who want an optimal blend of readability and accuracy. Now, in a way, I don't like putting it this way. Language is super complicated. It's more interesting than that simple binary, readability versus accuracy. I've come to conclude that those two things can be usefully distinguished, but they're not ultimately separable. Think with me here. A readable translation that isn't accurate isn't really a translation. It's paraphrase or something worse. But an accurate translation of the Bible that isn't readable also isn't accurate. Or it's only accurate if the passage was unreadable to the original writers and readers. So if God inspired a passage that was unreadable to the Jews when they first read it in the Old Testament, then it's okay to translate it in such a way that it's unreadable to us. Theologically speaking, however, I'm not going to expect that to happen very often. Difficult, maybe, yeah. Peter said some things Paul wrote are hard to understand. Unreadable? No, I don't think so. Usually the difficulty of passages is not at the word level, but more at the sentence level. What is it referring to? So when the Ethiopian eunuch is evangelized by Philip, and he says to him in Acts 4, I think it is, he reads to him this passage of Isaiah talking about the suffering servant, and he says, not, what does this mean? I don't get it. It's, to whom does this passage refer? He understands what it says at the word level. He just doesn't know who the suffering servant is. That's more like the way, that's more the interplay of accuracy and readability. It's readable, and it is accurate, but it's difficult not at the word level. We get the words, we just don't know what the reference is, if that makes sense. Are we really going to say about the Bible that God inspired unreadable portions or used words nobody knew they were misunderstanding? I don't think so. But as often with non-specialists, there is something substantive lying underneath the fight between readability and accuracy. Translators do get to and have to make judgment calls. And sometimes they have an ear for the way people talk, or with Tyndale and Luther, an ear for the way people will talk when their translations become really popular and influential. Translation is a constant necessary tension between sticking to the forms of the original, the word order, the sentence structure, the parts of speech, and getting the message across to readers. So if you listen to people talk who have to translate from any language to any other, you're going to hear them say, I totally get what they're saying here in Spanish or French or Kazakh or Urdu, but it's really hard to put into English. I've had that same experience with English. I was tasked once with trying to come up with a way to translate a Puritan book into contemporary English. And I'm pretty good at both of those things. It was very hard. I stopped. It's work I hope to pick up again. It's very difficult. Good and intelligent people are permitted to differ about exactly how close you should stick to the forms of the Hebrew and Greek in any given case. They're free to work by feel and not by strict rules, because guess what? They're going to do it anyway. Translation is a science. There's a lot of science that goes into it, but when the translator actually sits down to put pen to paper, there's a ton of art that goes into it too. Dare I say, creativity. What is the best way to put this into English. It's so hard for us to think like that because we have Tyndale. But think of Tyndale, who had to come up with ways to say stuff that wasn't obvious, wasn't default in his culture or in his church. They all talked in Latin. We have to give some freedom to these gifted translators. Translation is an art and a science. Language is not reducible to math. So you're not going to get a perfect and identical solution in every case. Do you know that people have actually tried to invent languages that are so perfectly logical that they eliminate the possibility of misunderstanding? I read a whole book, I'm not kidding about this, it was an awesome book, by Ulrika Okrent called In the Land of Invented Languages. The languages that you may have heard of in that book include Esperanto. Anybody heard of Esperanto? Esperanto is the one invented language that a bunch of people actually speak. It's kind of like a distillation and simplification of a bunch of Romance languages. It's pretty neat. Another that you probably have heard of, because you're Americans, and we Americans, our forefathers died for the right for us to have televisions, is Klingon. Klingon, it's not just a joke on Star Trek. I mean, some people took it really seriously and have invented a language, Klingon. So those were in there, but a language you probably never heard of in that book is called Lobjan. It's almost like a math equation, but Ulrika Okrent in that book describes very effectively it's an ultimate failure. Why can't a language be so perfectly precise that it successfully communicates every bit of information, no more, no less, every time? It's because we're not computers, we're humans. Humans don't operate that way. We can communicate very successfully. We can communicate unsuccessfully too, but most of the time we communicate successfully. We do so very well. But there's just no way for me to ensure that every bit of information I send to you, you get, and every bit of information you send back to me, I get perfectly. That's just not the way it is in a world in which we're all fallen and finite. And yet what's super interesting is that you actually can do a little math of a sort on a Bible translation and observe the results of the art of translation. And someone has done it. His name is Andy Wu, and I've met him. I interviewed him at the Bible Tech Conference put on by Logos Bible Software a number of years ago. And here's the thing. If there's one pro-King James only meme that I really feel I eviscerated, incinerated, and obliterated, that I beat to death and then burned alive, and after that kept on bread and water for 6 weeks, it's the idea that the King James only has put forth constantly that Flesch-Kincaid reading level analyses prove that the King James is on a 5th grade reading level. I am told this on a regular basis. You can't complain about the King James readability and the archaisms because the computers have proven that it's on a 5th grade reading level. And the NIV is actually harder to read based on computer-graded reading level analyses. I remember the day when I was sitting at my desk and realizing I just know they're wrong, but I don't know why, because I did not know how these reading level analyses worked. And I was like, okay, it falls to me to figure this out. And very shortly thereafter, I realized it's complete bunkum. There's lies, you know what lies, and statistics. And I've showed that people who use Flesch-Kincaid have no idea what they're really doing. How in the world could it be that a computer knows better how readable a text is than readers do? All Flesch-Kincaid is doing is counting the length of words and sentences and trying to do a little math to approximate a grade level that's familiar to us on the K through 12 spectrum. In general, they're saying short words are easier, short sentences are easier, long sentences are harder, long words are harder. And that in general is true, but it utterly ignores the timeline. What does the word call, C-A-L-L, mean? You know it. You can make a phone call. You can call out to someone. That's not a hard word. And it is one syllable. What does the word call, C-A-U-L, mean that occurs in the King James Version? Does anybody know? I don't know. Let me see here. I think that's a cowl, C-O-W-L. Yeah, no problem. What's that? No, that's cull, C-U-L-L. Boy, those are actually the best answers I've ever gotten. They were close. A caul, C-A-U-L, is some kind of lobe of fat on an animal that's referenced in passages about the sacrificial system. How many syllables is the word caul, C-A-L-L? 1. How many syllables is the word caul, C-A-U-L? 1. Guess what? No, it's only 1. C-A-U-L is only 1. It's not caul, it's caul. Flesh Kincaid cannot tell the difference between the two. To Flesh Kincaid, they count exactly the same toward the readability analysis, but we all know that's not the case. And there are long words like asparagus that aren't considered difficult. And so Flesh Kincaid is kind of a rough and ready measure for librarians who just cannot possibly read the whole profusion of children's books, and they have to have some shorthand that kind of helps them recognize what book is on what level. But it has utterly nothing to do with the King James versus modern translations. And I did have one King James guy who apologized one time to me, and he said, "You persuaded me, I will never use that argument again." But he's the only one. So I was skeptical when I first encountered the work of Andy Wu. I was primed to think that computer-generated statistics just couldn't tell us very much valuable information about Bible translations. But I knew Andy was a sharp guy, a serious guy, so I gave him a listen. And I saw quickly he did know what he was doing, and he did act responsibly. It doesn't mean his conclusions are perfectly airtight or heaven sent. It means that he helped use a combination of math and careful reading to tell us something useful about the CSB. And I want to talk through his report and show you why it was so responsible. It's called A Quantitative Evaluation of the Christian Standard Bible. And it compares the CSB with most of the major versions used by evangelical Christians. I don't think the LSB was on there because it hadn't come out yet. Wu is an expert in machine learning. He actually helped create some nerdy stuff in Logos that analyzes the syntax of Bible sentences. Really cool stuff, but really advanced stuff. So advanced, I myself don't use it very often, but I basically understand what it does, and it's really, really neat. Though Wu's report on the CSB doesn't really reveal his methodology in detail, I kind of figured out what he did. He measured the literalness and the readability of each translation based on a few criteria that we're going to talk about, and then he weighed the balance between the two, okay? Literalness and readability, or you could say accuracy and readability. So I'm on record many times saying computers cannot read, and this is true. I think it'll always be true. I don't really think that what AI is doing is reading. Somehow I want to reserve that for humans. Maybe in 5 years, I'll regret saying that. It is amazing what AI can do. But I insist that computers don't understand, because along with Neil Postman and others who've thought about this, I think computers are not in a situation. And what is understanding among humans? I mean, that is a really difficult question. It is the relationship, it is forming relationships among facts, and then there is a necessary affective dimension. How do you respond to that fact? Are you inclined toward the truth here, disinclined away? I think human understanding is something computers will never really do, even though I do love Commander Data on Star Trek. So Wu, even though computers can't read, he used the power of computers to mimic certain aspects of reading, things that humans like Wu have taught them to recognize. I don't really understand the computer side of this, but I do understand the linguistic side. So Wu used 2 measures for literalness. I could feasibly say accuracy. And he used 2 measures for readability. His measures for literalness were, now I'll explain this, the transfer rate of syntactic relations and the consistency rate of word choices. Okay, I'll explain this. Syntactic relations is just technical terminology for the basic meaning-carrying units of a sentence. You know these as subject, verb, and object. That's what we're talking about with syntax and syntactic relations. Basically, people like Andy Wu have taught computers to guess pretty accurately which words in a given English sentence are the subject, verb, or object, plus a few other less important syntactic relations. Then they've gone through and marked all these syntactic relationships in the Greek New Testament, at least by hand. And this produces a tree of relationships, much like a sentence diagram. So it's kind of like Andy Wu taught the computer to diagram the Greek New Testament. I happen to have a professor who did just that. He diagrammed the entire Greek New Testament. It's a very revealing exercise because it forces you to ask in any given case, what is the grammatical role being played by a given word? Okay? So Wu had the computer diagram the Hebrew and Greek text to display the subjects, verbs, and objects. Then he did the same with each English translation. Then he used connections between the English and Hebrew and Greek that have been made by humans. We call these interlinears. Maybe you've seen them before, where you map every English word in the LSB onto the Greek or Hebrew word from which it's translated. And then he used that interlinear data to see how often the diagrams matched up, basically. So basically, you diagram the Greek, you diagram the English, and you see how often the diagram structure matches up. That is one measure of how literal a given translation is. How often does it match tightly? How often does it not match? Now, this might raise a question. Why doesn't every translation perfectly match the Hebrew and Greek syntactic relations? Subjects should be subjects, verbs should be verbs, objects should be objects. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Wouldn't that be the first job of every translator? Well, let me talk through just one example. I don't have access to Wu's data, so I can't verify this is the kind of thing he's measuring, but I'm pretty confident. Think about Ephesians 2, 1 and 2. Would you turn there with me, actually? I will also open it in the LSB. Ephesians chapter 2. While you turn, Ephesians is really precious to me because it's the very first book that I got to travel all the way through under an expository preaching ministry when I was in college. And my mind and heart just came alive listening to this. And I still remember, now this is 1998 or so, maybe 99, hearing my pastor, major mentor of mine, preaching through this passage. Okay, Ephesians 2, 1 and 2. In the LSB it says, "And you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience." And actually the sentence continues, at least in this translation, the period is at the end of verse 3, but I'll stop after verse 2. Let me read it very literally from Greek. What that means is using conventional, like classroom level Greek translation skills. "And you being dead in the trespasses and the sins of you, in which once you walked according to the age of this world." I just stopped kind of in the middle there. So this is just the beginning of a crazy long Pauline Greek sentence. One that isn't actually really a sentence because the main verb doesn't actually come along until never. There's actually no main verb. My professor, Randy Leedy, has his Greek New Testament diagrams explain what Paul is doing here. He gets so wrapped up in his qualifiers and explanations for what we were up to when we were dead, that he ends up ending the clause before he gets to the main verb. Nobody that I've ever seen in English Bible translation, however, has had the heart to allow a non-sentence in English when they come to this passage. So they all divvy up Paul's very long non-sentence in various ways. That's one way in which the diagrams will no longer match up. The judgment of all English Bible translators is that English just cannot handle being perfectly literal in that way, matching Paul's sentence structure. Another example of how it's difficult to map from language to language. In verse 1 in the LSB, it says, "You were dead in your transgressions and sins." There's a footnote on the word were. What is it? It says, in my copy of the LSB, literally being, "And you being dead in your transgressions and sins." That is an absolutely common, day in and day out thing that Greek does. They like to start sentences or clauses, which are, the kernel of a sentence. They like to start them with these participles. We just don't do that in English. We kind of can, but a lot of the times when we do, it's because we're translating the Greek New Testament. It's not natural for us. So the LSB is right to change that participle to a finite linking verb. And you were dead in your transgressions and sins. Did they change the Bible? No. They translated it into English. But the little literal there in the footnote indicates they could have been more literal. And Credit Nasby would be really upset by this, your LSB. They could have been more literal. They didn't. No, they did the right thing, but they took a little step away by using a finite verb, a linking verb. They took a little step away from the sentence structure that's actually in the Greek. That's the kind of thing that Andy Wu was measuring. Every single translation does this sort of thing. They only differ on how often and under what circumstances. So Wu mapped these differences of opinion. He also mapped how often translations practice concordance. This is going to be a little easier to follow because we've already talked about it. It's consistency rate of word choices. Now, the King James translators actually talk about this explicitly in their preface. You'll hear me cite the King James translators often when I talk about translation. They are the gold standard on translation philosophy, in my estimation. I love their preface very dearly. I have a keyboard shortcut, caps lock 6. Bam, it opens up the translators to the reader in Logos Bible software because I love it so much. I am a true nerd. I am a true nerd. The King James translators say in their preface, it's impossible to maintain perfect consistency in word choice in Bible translation. The example that they give, you know what? I'm going to show you this. I can be a little, I can spend a little more time here. Here is an excellent modern edition of the King James Version called the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible. And here is what the King James translators say in that preface, about literal translation. Another thing we think good to admonish thee of, gentle reader, is that we have not tied ourselves to a uniformity of phrasing or to an identity of words. That's what they're talking about, concordance, using the same English word every time a given Hebrew word appears. Or, same with Greek. Every time the word agape appears, we have to use the word love. They said we did not do that. There were some people who wanted us to. That's what they're saying. As some peradventure would wish that we have done. Why would people want that? Well, because they observed that some learned men somewhere have been exact as they could that way. Who are men like that? It's Young, Robert Young, and Young's literal translation. It's whatever the guy was behind the Pure Word New Testament. People who get fixated on the idea that if I'm going to be accurate, I must use the same English word every time a given Greek or Hebrew word appears. This is a very old idea. It's an implicit denial that God can speak our language, and the King James translators are right to reject it. They said, truly, that we might not vary from the sense of that which we had translated before, if the word signified the same thing in both places, for there be some words that be not of the same sense everywhere. We were especially careful and made a conscience according to our duty. In other words, they did very frequently use the same word, the English word, when translating a given Greek and Hebrew word, as long as it got the sense across. But that we should express the same notion in the same particular word as, for example, if we translate the Hebrew or Greek word once by purpose, never to call it intent. They're about to say they didn't do this. They didn't think to themselves, if we use the word purpose, we have to use the word purpose everywhere to translate that Hebrew or Greek word. We can never call it intent. If we use the word journeying somewhere, we can never call it traveling. If we use the word think somewhere to translate a given Greek word, we can never use suppose in another passage. Pain and ache, joy and gladness. They say we're not stuck with using the same word. Thus, to mince the matter, we thought to savor more of curiosity than wisdom. And curiosity right there that's actually a false friend, and I forget what it means, but it's like being pedantic, I think, giving way too much exactness and detail on something that doesn't merit it. And that rather it would breed scorn in the atheist than bring profit to the godly reader. And I love this. For is the kingdom of God become words or syllables? Why should we be in bondage to them if we may be free? Why should we use one precisely when we may use another no less fit as commodiously? That's a little difficult, but why should we use precisely one and only one English word to translate a given Greek word when another one fits just fine? I love that. That is wisdom right there. That, boy, oh, I just love the King James translators. And what do you end up with when humans have to make a decision about lexical concordance, consistency rate of word choices? You end up with differences. The LSB is probably more lexically concordant than the ESV by a little bit, I would guess, because it comes from the NASB. The King James is a little less lexically concordant, I would say, than the ESV is. In general, taken all together, that would be my judgment. Andy Wu tried to quantify this. So some translations are going to be more consistent in various ways. But what do people say about consistency? Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. I don't want to be just insulting here, but I prefer for my bridge engineers to be consistent, but language is not the kind of science that bridge construction is. And even in bridge construction, I like a beautiful bridge versus a merely utilitarian one, don't you? And the effort for beauty has to be a part of translation. So when translations put it all together, and when Andy Wu went through and mapped all this out, what did he find? Well, I can't show you yet. We have to talk a little bit more about nerdy stuff than I can. So those were Andy Wu's two measures of what did he call it? Well, basically of accuracy. That's how he measured accuracy. Are those the only measures of accuracy that there are? Lexical concordance and syntactic relations being the same? No, absolutely not. There are more measures, but those are the things that computers can see through the little slit where you insert the 3.5-inch floppy disk. There's that little slit. That's the only thing computers can see out of, so that's all they can see. He picked stuff that the computers can actually handle, which is very natural to do. Nothing wrong with that. And they are relatively important measures of what we tend to regard as counting as literal or formal Bible translation. How did he measure readability then? It was really ingenious. I like this. Two things: syntactic fluency rate and common vocabulary rate. We're 19 minutes from being done here, and you've really stuck it out. You are awake right after I said syntactic fluency rate, and you're still looking at me. I mean, this is incredible. Thank you. I'm going to explain these things. The common vocabulary rate is probably the easier one. It measures the conformity of vocabulary to current usage. Okay? It assumes that a translation is easier to read if more of the words in that translation are in the daily usage corpus of the target language. How do we know such a thing? How do we know what words English speakers use daily? The dictionary is actually using the same tool I'm about to point to. What? Okay, that's part of it actually. Depends. A corpus is a technical linguistics word and lexicographical word for a huge collection of written or transcribed texts. Commercials might be included. Usually, however, honestly, I guess I don't know the full extent of all the corpuses used by various Bible translation organizations. The one I use is because it's free. And it was put out originally, by Brigham Young University, Mormon school. But it's called News on the Web. And it collects over 1 billion news articles written in English from all around the world. And I just search a word, and then I can see how is that word getting used in these web articles. Or I could do what Andy Wu is doing, and I could see, well, what are the 10,000 words that get used the most? And then I could compare that to what are the words that get used the most in my CSB or NIV or LSB. A corpus is relying on the idea that the dictionary does not determine what our language is. It describes it. Now, then we turn around and ask it to tell us what to do. That's understandable. What is it describing? It's describing the way educated people use English. And we use a corpus to do that. When, this is not the only measure to use, but when you combine it with others, it does help contribute to the overall picture. And the syntactic fluency rate is similar. It measures not words so much as sentence patterns. If we're trying to measure with a computer how readable is a given translation, Andy Wu assumed, quote, that a translation is easier to read if its sentence patterns are more similar to those found in daily usage. You've all heard Yoda, love you, I do. And he's flipping the syntax of English, and he's famous for it. Have you ever known a person who does that? Not really, because that's not really English. Like, it technically works, but it's communicating something very specific about Yoda, and that's that he's odd. He's coming from somewhere else. It lends this air of mystery to him as some kind of, Eastern martial arts teacher. But nobody talks like that. But sometimes our Bible translations do, because they're trying to literally reflect the order of the words in the Greek and Hebrew. And you can measure that with computer tests. Okay, so what did Wu come up with? What were the results? I actually think the results tend to validate his methods because they match up quite well with that spectrum graph that I showed you the other day. I think that's pretty remarkable. All of those judgments are hard to quantify, but Wu did basically as good a job as you can. So for example, if you use those measures, the ESV transfers syntactic relations more consistently than any other translation. I get that. They use the same sentence structure. That accords with my experience. The New Living Translation, among the evangelical translations Wu looked at, the NLT does it the least often. Using Wu's measures, the King James is more consistent in its use of concordance than any other major translation. I mean, that's very interesting because the King James translators denied being obligated to do this, but they did do it more than any other major translation that we still use. Wu is a scholar. He knows what he's doing. He knows that his evaluation metrics are still pretty basic, that he's only evaluating words rather than senses of words, but there's no way, nobody's made a database that allows you to go into the senses of words. So, if you combine the two measures of literalness that Wu used, you actually get the ESV at the top, the NASB next, which is where the LSB would be, then the King James, then the New King James. And at the bottom, you're not going to be surprised by this, you have the Net Bible, the NIV, and the New Living Translation. What do you think was right in the middle? The CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. The translations are not that far from one another. The differences are not massive. But it's also not accidental that those translations lined up where they did and that the CSB wound up in the middle. Now, the report gets into much greater complexity, but I gave to you the essence of it, the methods by which Wu evaluated the readability and accuracy of these translations against one another. And I also think it's very interesting that the CSB aimed to be in the middle, and then Andy Wu found it was in the middle. I will acknowledge Andy Wu was doing his work in part for the people who made the CSB. And you could be a cynic and you could say, aha, they paid him to find the result that they wanted him to find. But that's why I spent so much time myself looking into what his methods were. And I'm persuaded those are reasonable methods. AI may give us even better methods in time to come, but at the time, given where technology was, Andy Wu did an excellent job, and I'm ready to say, I think he nailed it. The CSB is right in the middle between readability and accuracy. Therefore, who is the CSB Bible best for? It's best for people who can't make up their minds between formal and functional translations. I'm one of those people. I used to assume early in seminary that literal was moral. The NIV is bad. Then I came to feel that each approach was useful, but that I still had to figure out once and for all which of the two approaches was better. But then I started to realize I didn't want either side to win. I wanted to have both kinds of translations, and I liked being able to turn to one or the other in specific situations. I've said that you want to look at translations for their utility. What's the best Bible translation for this particular circumstance? Often, however, you really can't measure that in advance. You don't know who's going to show up for your vacation Bible school class. You don't know who's going to show up on the bus next to you, whether it's going to be a drunk, as it was the case with me many times on the bus traveling to and fro to work up in Washington, or whether it was going to be a very bright science student, as it turned out to be, the one guy I evangelized the most, or a bus driver that always loved to talk to me who was a writer. I mean, if you just want to kind of hit the middle to try to prepare for any situation, and we're not talking about a massive distance between the literal ones and the not literal ones, but still, if you want to be in the middle, the CSB is a great place to be. And finally, the CSB is the best Bible translation for people who feel the CSB buzz that's going on right now. I've written before that, unfortunately, a rising tide can sink all boats. A rising tide of Bible translation has made a lot of Christians, let alone non-Christians, wonder what in the world is going on. Somebody asked me during the break, is money doing this to us? Do we have all these translations because of money? And I said, I'm not so cynical about that. I do think we would be foolish to deny that money could be playing a role here, and even an undue role. But in a way, I'm like, if the publishers out there are too dedicated to money, and that is not my experience with them. I know some of these people personally, at Crossway for sure, and at Zondervan and Thomas Nelson. I know the Bible publishers there. I looked at being one of them. Just like yesterday, a job came up, and I've had some interest in that. Didn't quite fit me. I think I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing, but I could do that job. I know these people, they're serious, they're not in it for the money, they don't drive Maseratis. And I know the Bible translators who worked on these translations. They are certainly not in it for the money. I don't want to embarrass him, but Vern Poitras, I asked him one time, what kind of car do you drive? What house do you live in? He said, I drive a 2008 Honda Odyssey. And he said, I live in the same house that I've lived in with my wife ever since we got married in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I said, Vern, did you get wealthy off of translating the ESV? And he just laughed. There's no answer to that question. Obviously not. When I worked at Crossway briefly, my definite impression of the leadership there is that they are fallen and finite, serious Christians who love the Lord and are trying to serve the church. If they are secretly sinning and secretly money grubbing, I can't know that. All I can do is benefit from what God has done through their sin. They gave me an awesome Bible translation. It's between them and God if they want money more than they ought to. There's some level of wanting money that's necessary. I hate to say this, but I'm paid to be here because the laborer is worthy of his hire. And neither Jesse nor I felt awkward about that fact. I think the same is true of Bible translations, and we shouldn't use that fact to be cynical about them. Nonetheless, the longer a translation has been out, the more likely it is to get attacked, especially in our multi-translation world. So the King James has been slammed by lots of people. The NIV has been slammed by lots of people. The ESV has been slammed by lots of people. The NASB has been slammed by lots of people. The New Living Translation has been slammed by lots of people. They've been out long enough that they've garnered some distrust, most of which I think is unfair, all of them. But one nice thing about the CSB, in my estimation, just kind of reading the buzz out on the internet, is that it hasn't been out very long, and not a lot of people have attacked it. So if you hand it to somebody that you're trying to evangelize, it's a good, middle-of-the-road translation. And if they go search online for CSB, they're not going to find a bunch of people attacking it, thinking, what in the world is my friend doing giving me this strange Bible? It's not attached to an agenda in the public mind, at least at the moment. So the CSB is the best Bible translation for certain people in certain circumstances. And if you have curiosity about the other best Bible translations there are, then you can go to my YouTube channel and watch the other videos that I have explaining why various translations are the best.